Hi, this is Paul, and many of you who've been following my channel for a while know that it's been my plan to do a series on C.S. Lewis and Jordan Peterson. Now you might wonder why those two together. Those of you who are familiar with the Christian community will know that Lewis is an important author, not without his controversies, but there's some reasons why I think Lewis is a particularly good counterpart for processing Jordan Peterson's thoughts and I think his contribution. Lewis, a lot of times people ask me for book recommendations, and I often give the recommendation that my Henry Zwanstra, my history professor at Calvin Theological Seminary, gave. He didn't give a book recommendation. He said, once you go out into the ministry, spend some time studying one of these four significant Christian thinkers: Augustine, Luther, Calvin, and C.S. Lewis. Now it's pretty amazing that C.S. Lewis would make that list. This recommendation was given me in the 80s when I was in seminary, because C.S. Lewis hasn't been around that long. But C.S. Lewis engages the issues that we're dealing with in ways that I think are extremely helpful and fresh. I'll do a little bit of biographical information on Lewis, but if these two more recent biographies of Lewis, I think, capture a lot of him and touch on a lot of the points and parts that a lot of Jordan Peterson fans will find relevant. The Narnian I read a number of years ago. I'm going to read it again, and C.S. Lewis: A Life by Alistair McGrath. Those of you who are Christians and into theology might recognize McGrath's name. I've mentioned him in his History on the Protestant Reformation. He teaches theological history in England. He himself is a convert, as he notes in this book, and I think it's a really helpful biography. There are a lot of biographies of Lewis out there. He's an important thinker for Christians, and both of these biographies I can quite easily recommend. Now, Lewis was born at the end of the 19th century, and this is a picture of him and his family out in front of their family home called Little Lee. And one of the things that's important to know about Lewis is that his mother died 3 years after this picture was taken. Lewis was certainly old enough to remember her and old enough to grieve her. And when Lewis's mother died, it in some ways ripped the heart out of that family. The father was I don't know the difference in England between solicitors and barristers, but I think he was a solicitor, and he was kind of lost in terms of how to father his sons. Lewis has an older brother named Warnie, who was a few years older than him, and Lewis was the youngest of two sons. And one of the issues that came up after he was raised in Belfast, Northern Ireland. It's important to remember that Lewis is from Northern Ireland, and all the complexities as that means with respect to the tension between Protestants and Catholics. And I think that had something to do with Lewis's promotion later on of what Lewis called mere Christianity. That, the long history of violence and struggle in Northern Ireland between Roman Catholics and Protestants is a tortured history. And I'm old enough to remember that violence being on the news. It seems to have settled down quite significantly over the last number of years. But this was the context of Lewis's upbringing before he went off to school in England. And for Lewis, his years of going off to school were torturous ones. Lewis hated these boarding schools that he went into, and in fact, Alistair McGrath notes that he spends 3 chapters in his own half-life autobiography, Surprised by Joy, on these school years, and he says almost nothing about World War I. And Alistair McGrath goes into that fairly significantly, and I think handles it well. What happened to Lewis in these schools that were so torturous for him. And to the degree that it even caused tension between he and his brother Warney, because Warney thought, in Surprised by Joy, Lewis was too harsh on the schools he attended, because Warney had shared at least one of those schools with him. So Lewis had a tough time growing up. He had a difficult childhood. His father was a Christian. He was an Anglican, a good Protestant Anglican of Northern Ireland, but fairly young in his life, Lewis rejected Christianity, and I'll give you a quote of that pretty soon. One of his best friends throughout life was Arthur Greaves, and Arthur is here on the left, and Lewis is here on the right. Arthur became a confidant of Lewis. Later, in the book, again, McGrath's book goes into this in quite a bit of depths. Lewis was, Arthur Greaves was gay, and Lewis was not, and it seems Greaves, very much had hoped for a relationship with Lewis, but Lewis wasn't gay, and Lewis's sexuality will become a part of the story for Lewis in terms of his relationships, his missing his mother. McGrath isn't afraid to go into the psychological aspect of that. Lewis, after a couple of really bad experiences with some of these schools. In fact, one of the schools was shut down because the headmaster was deemed by the state to be basically to be insane. And this gives you a sense of what poor Lewis had to suffer. First he loses his mother, then he has these horrible experiences in schools. His father is in some ways unprepared to raise him as a son. That their relationship was really troublesome all the way to his father's death. And this is the kind of normal suffering that myself as a pastor, or Peterson as a clinical psychologist, is used to seeing. This is common throughout life. I don't always think of all the things I want to put in my video when I'm making my PowerPoint, but Scott Alexander, who's a prominent blogger, has a great post that I've used in a number of sermons in terms of how bad it is. Suffering is common in people's lives, whether you're in a wealthy, affluent community or if you're in a distressed community. And I think in some ways, suffering can be ironically different in wealthy, affluent communities, because at least here in America, there's this underlying lie that says, well, if you're wealthy and white and privileged and all of these things, then you won't suffer. And it's just a complete lie. People suffer all over the place for all kinds of reasons. And so this was very much part of Lewis's growing up. Now, by the time he began being tutored by William Kirkpatrick, who Lewis called the Old Knock, Lewis was already an atheist, and Kirkpatrick was an affirmed atheist. And so what Kirkpatrick really did for Lewis was give him all the intellectual and logical ammunition to affirm his atheism. And maybe I can jump to the book and pull up that chapter, his confession to Greaves about his atheism. See if I can find it. We'll get to his passion for mythology soon, which is, okay, the only person to whom Lewis appeared to be able to open his heart regarding his religious beliefs was Arthur Greaves, who had by now completely displaced Warney, Lewis's brother, as Lewis's soulmate and confidant. In October 1916, Lewis provided Greaves with a full statement of his lack of religious belief. "I believe in no religion. All religions," he wrote, "are simply mythologies invented by human beings, usually in a response to natural events or emotional needs. Thus," he declared, "it is the recognized scientific account of the growth of religions." And if you want to read someone fun on that, read Chesterton. So this is where Lewis was. Religion is irrelevant to the question of morality, and Lewis lived that way. But also what was central to his relationship with Greaves was his love for mythology. Greaves was ill at one point. This was before Greaves came out to Lewis in terms of where his sexual desires were, and Lewis was visiting Greaves once, and Lewis agreed to visit Greaves with some reluctance. They weren't friends yet, really. And he found him sitting up in bed with a book beside him, HMA's Gerber's Myths of the Norsemen, 1908. Luther, whose love of northernness now knew no bounds, looked at the book in astonishment. "Do you like that?" he asked, only to receive the same excited reply from Greaves. Lewis had finally found a soulmate. He would remain in touch regularly with Lewis, regularly until Lewis's death nearly 50 years later. And this brings Lewis onto a whole journey with mythology. And while Lewis completely rejected Christianity, rejected his father's faith, it was the faith of his mother as well. His mother was the daughter of an Anglican, was she Anglican or Methodist? I don't remember. It might have been Methodist. The daughter of a clergyman, of a pastor. And so Lewis had completely given up on faith and was a proud, boastful, triumphal atheist who felt free to live exactly as he wanted to, and that's what he would do. And he became, in his own words to Grieve at one point, a complete liar. He lied. When we get into his relationship with Mrs. Moore, he lied to his father regularly and completely about everything in his life. And Lewis thought that this was, absolutely who he was and what he should do. So Lewis, Kirkpatrick basically got Lewis ready to go into Oxford, but what happened, of course, before he could go into Oxford was the war, and World War I at that point was just chewing up the young men of England at an incredible rate, as well as France and Germany. And Lewis's brother Warney was already in the war. He had taken he was an officer and taken a route into that. And so Lewis, while he was, he knew he wanted to be an academic, he knew he wanted to teach at Oxford. This was the path Lewis loved. Lewis loved books. Lewis read just about everything in classical literature in the original languages, and seemed to have a photographic memory. He could remember it all. He would play games later as an Oxford Don. Basically what his job was a tutor, and so he would sit and tutor students. And there are accounts from some of his students of a game he would play where he would turn his back to the bookshelf, and he would tell a student, pick off a book out of that shelf and open it up to anywhere, and they'd pick up a book and they'd open it. Lewis's back would be to them, so he wouldn't know what book. So then they would read something from the book in whatever language the book was in, and Lewis would then tell him what book it was from, tell him the context of the reading in the book, and elucidate why the reading was important. I mean, this man was so brilliant, but also so incredibly well read, not only in terms of classics, but in terms of, he read everything that had to do with mythology in the West and the classical period in Latin, in Greek. I don't know if Lewis knew Hebrew, but knew modern languages. Incredibly brilliant man, just masters of all of this. But here he goes into World War I, and he's staying at Harvard. Harvard was basically turned into army barracks at that point, because there were no young men to study at that point. And so along the way he develops a friendship with another young man, Paddy Moore, and so he develops this friendship with this young man, and it winds up they're both going off to fight in the trenches in France, and they develop a pact. And basically the pact was that if either of them made it out of the war and the other didn't, that the one who survived would take care of the other one's family. And as it turned out, Lewis was wounded, but not wounded terribly. He was wounded just enough to get sent back to England, but not wounded so badly as to impair him. And so this wound was, really a lifesaver for him. And he returned to England and recovered from his wounds, and the war ended. And then he took up, in fact, to fulfill his promise and to take care of Paddy's mother, who was a divorced woman, and his sister, Maureen. Now, what happens here is there's not a lot of direct evidence, but most contemporary scholars of Lewis believe that for Lewis, Maureen became both a lover and a mother figure for him. And so what begins here is a relationship that would last for decades. And Lewis, in fact, not Maureen. Maureen is Patty's sister. Mrs. Moore, who Lewis called Minto. He began a relationship with her, a surreptitious relationship that he kept from his father, and the exact nature of it he kept hidden from his friends. And most, at least a lot of contemporary scholars, believe, in fact, that they were lovers. And again, as I said, Lewis kept this relationship from his father, kept the details of the relationship from many people in his life, and kept this open secret. And in fact, Lewis cared for Mrs. Moore until she died. And there are passages, for example, in the Narnian, where and in McGrath's biography, where Lewis, he's an Oxford Don, he's an ascending academic star, and he keeps running back to take care of, get increasingly senile and angry and bitter Mrs. Moore and her little dog that, defecates in the house all over the place. And Lewis's friends and colleagues wonder, why are you taking care of this woman? And in my own opinion, probably this relationship for Lewis, he wasn't legally married to this woman. No one would have thought any less of the man if he had just found another way to, in a sense, dispose of her. And in fact, there was a terrible relationship between Warney and Mrs. Moore when the three of them were living together at the Kilns. But Lewis, pours his life out for this woman, and does for her what she doesn't deserve to have done for her. And to me, this Lewis is doing this then, after he's a Christian and after, whatever was left of Mrs. Moore's sexual attractiveness was past. And I think about this, and I think about Lewis and the kinds of insights he had into the common depravity of human beings. One of the things that you learn as a pastor is that, and I've spoken about this before, that people are, they're in some sense most themselves at home, but they can sometimes be their cruelest selves at home. People will say and do things to their spouses and their children and their parents, people that they live with, that they wouldn't dare do to a total stranger, because a total stranger might hit them or curse them or walk away from them. But those with whom people are imprisoned in domestic life in all sorts of ways are so often the victims of our greatest cruelty. And so when I look at the depth that Lewis had for the kinds of things we see in human cruelty. You read that in Lewis's book, Screwtape Letters. You read that in Lewis's book, The Great Divorce. Lewis had a deep insight into the fact that to be Christian means to be Christian in your marriage and with your children and with your parents and with your spouses, even and especially when those relationships aren't working out as you would want. Those are for Christians some of the toughest places where Christians have to work out their faith. And I think Lewis learns this in his relationship with Mrs. Moore. Well, Lewis goes on, and he begins to have a very promising career as an academic. Gets a teaching appointment at Magdalen College within Oxford University. And Lewis, I think, again, part of the reason he's such an excellent conversation partner for me with Peterson is that in some ways Lewis was like Peterson in a lot of different ways. One of the ways is that Lewis, as a lecturer, was, according to all accounts, spontaneous. He was so knowledgeable, so well read, and had everything just at the tip of his mind that he filled lecture halls at Oxford, and he he filled lecture halls with people that are just hungry to listen to him. And his lectures were rambly, and he'd go off and he'd touch on this and he'd touch on that and he'd touch on this. He eventually, as a Christian, started the Socratic Society at the college, where he would where he and actually most of the members of the Socratic Society were women who were then, after the war, studying at Oxford. And Lewis and others would debate Christianity and debate its reasonableness. And just what I wouldn't give to be able to sit in those rooms. It's too bad that those lectures weren't recorded back in the day. There are a few recordings of Lewis's voice. He had this deep, booming voice. On Audible, you can find his a recording of The Four Loves, and there are a few little recordings of the BBC radio pieces that he did that eventually became Mere Christianity. So Lewis becomes this author, but then he also picks up a relationship along the way with JRR Tolkien. And as McGrath notes at the beginning of the book, it's quite likely we would not have The Lord of the Rings if it had not been for C.S. Lewis. Because one of the things that Lewis and Tolkien's founded, in a sense, a reading society that they called the Inklings. And what they did was that they read their works one to another to encourage them. And a lot of their works had to do with mythology. And in a sense, what Tolkien was doing with Lord of the Rings was to try to write a new mythology. And every time Peterson asks, how hard is it to write a fairy tale, Peterson should talk to J.R.R. Tolkien. And because Tolkien understood, as a philologist, that if he wanted to create a new myth, if he wanted to create a new fairy tale, he needed to surround the story itself with a vital world, and a fundamental aspect of that world needed to be language. And so that's exactly what Tolkien did. And Tolkien, as many of you know who are Tolkien fans, first wrote The Hobbit from stories he would tell his children at bedtime. And Tolkien, as some of you may know, was a deeply committed Roman Catholic, which is interesting because, of course, Lewis eventually became an Anglican. And if you read Lewis's upbringing, the tensions in Northern Ireland meant that there was a lot of tribal animosity between Roman Catholics and Anglicans in Northern Ireland. And while some have always speculated that perhaps Lewis could have become a Catholic, he never did, and he stayed in the Anglican Church. But Lewis's commitment to mere Christianity, which may in fact come from George MacDonald, was, kind of bridges that. And this is part of the reason why I think Lewis is so vital for the evangelical world, which is multi-denominational or sometimes anti-denominational. So Lewis in fact, develops his love of mythology. He's tutored by the great Knock. He goes to war. Let's zip ahead. But as the biography often notes, it's mythology that really captures Lewis. And so Lewis, while he gives up his belief in God, begins a voracious study of joy. And this is the end of this chapter. Yet Lewis found in his imagination and reason pulling him in totally different directions. He continued to find himself experiencing deep feelings of desire, to which he attached the name joy. And this is why Lewis writes in his half autobiography, Surprised by Joy. The most important of these took place on March 1916, when he happened to pick up a copy of George MacDonald's fantasy novel, Phantastes, and he read without realizing it. As he read without realizing it, Lewis was led across a frontier of imagination. Everything was changed for him as a result of reading the book. He had discovered a new quality, a bright shadow, which seemed to him like a voice calling to him from the ends of the earth. That night my imagination was, in a certain sense, baptized. A new dimension to this life began to emerge. I had not the faintest notion that what I had let myself in for by buying Phantastes. It would be some time before Lewis made the connection between MacDonald's Christianity and his works of imagination, yet a seed had been planted, and it was only a matter of time before it began to germinate. And this is quite a few years before Lewis, in fact, would become a Christian. And this was, Lewis at the time, who was reading George MacDonald, was in many ways anti-Christian. And this comes through in some of Lewis's earliest writings, his poetry. So Lewis continues through the war years. He's in France. The undergraduates of Trinity term. So the book continues through this. And then, of course, he settles into his position, and he gets to know Tolkien, and he begins a relationship with Tolkien. Their common love of mythology really begins to bind them together. He studies classics. Let's jump through a little further to get to the chapter that I want to get to. His relationship with Mrs. Moore. He gets a fellowship at Magdalen College. His relationship with his father is just absolutely a wreck. And then he begins a relationship with Tolkien. And so they begin to talk. Lewis today is considered as a Christian writer, yet the tone of his writings of the early 1920s is unquestionably atheistic, severely critical, if not totally dismissive, of religion in general and Christianity in particular. So how and why did he change his mind? In this chapter, we'll consider the slow conversion. And let me talk about that, because I'll just put all my cards on the table. Why do I make these videos? Why do I spend my time with people? Because C.S. Lewis said that praise or worship, which is this crazy thing we do in church, is inner health made audible. He makes that comment in one of his reflections on the Psalms. And it has everything to do with joy. It has everything to do with a joy that I have, and a love for people, and wanting to share this joy. And I think this is, in fact, the reason for the creation of the world. And it's the reason that I enjoy being a Christian minister. And it's also the reason that I really enjoy being with people who aren't Christians. Now, that sounds like a weird thing, because I enjoy being with Christians too. But there is part of the discipline of accountability that we maintain within Christian community is to hold ourselves to a higher standard. Part of the downside of that accountability is sometimes the lying that Peterson talks about in terms of why pastors lie. Christians are sometimes not fully disclosing of themselves, I think partly just to limit the complexity of Christian accountability. And so Christians will sometimes keep a pretty firm editor on their lips, often about things which an unhealthy Christian culture that sometimes develops in the church creates. In other words, Christians will sometimes get cliquish, and in that cliquishness get dishonest, because Christians, just like everyone else, want to be affirmed and accepted and enjoyed by others. And this is part of the reason that we, in Peterson's words, we lie to one another. Part of what's refreshing for me in having conversations with non-Christian people is that filter doesn't exist for them. And so often happens with people who aren't Christians, and they have very little accountability in their life, is they will tell you exactly what they think. Now, there's other tribal lying that it goes on with them, and if you become known for something, like let's say if you become known like Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins for being an atheist, now you might have to do some keeping up appearances on that score too. But my my belief is, okay, so some of you have made comments in the comment section about my Calvinism. I believe that only God finally does convert us. I'm a Calvinist. That's part of the implications of our doctrines. I believe that, and I believe that God does this so often, not according to any timing that we can appreciate, but according to his own. Think, for example, about the stoning of Stephen, and in the New Testament, and Stephen, this ordained deacon who begins to preach with great power and talk against, says things about the temple that the other diaspora Jews in Jerusalem don't appreciate. And so, Stephen gets stoned, and then Saul the Pharisee, Saul, that's his Hebrew name, his Greek name is Paulus. Paul stands there holding the cloaks of those who stoned Stephen, in a sense, not getting his hands dirty, but approving of the murder. And God uses this to change Paul. Now, why didn't, he knocks him off his horse on the road to Damascus. And, we can play this what if game and say, why didn't God convert him earlier? I don't know. Why does God do what he do? I can't account for that. And I often find that trying to justify God's actions, it just can't be done. So conversion is something that, in my opinion, takes time. And I think that's sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes I have friends of mine who are Christians that will tell you stories that a lot of you wouldn't believe. And then people will come to me sometime and say, I'm a Christian because this thing happened to me. And they'll sit down and they'll say, I don't want to tell you this story because you'll think I'm crazy. And I just think, you'd be surprised what people will tell me. And listen to Peterson and Jung. Peterson, again, to his credit, talks about some of these dreams he's had. Now, he's a Jungian, and if you read Jung, Jung does the same stuff. So, Peterson gets it honestly from someplace. But when you listen to some of these dreams and visions that Peterson has had, I really respect the man for being able to talk about these things publicly. And so as a Calvinist, I believe that it is finally God and the Holy Spirit that changes our hearts. But the God of the Holy Spirit, who can intervene in history in miracles, is also the God of creation. So this is why I believe in the organic inspiration of the Bible, and why I believe that God moves through history, and why I believe that God uses preachers, even bad preachers, and why I believe that people listen to bad sermons and God uses them, and why I believe that God can use the most horrible things in the world to bring about the most beautiful. And so Lewis begins this process in his relationship with Tolkien. Initially, to affirm intellectual belief. In this chapter, we shall consider the slow conversion of Lewis from his early atheism, initially to affirm intellectual belief in God by the summer of 1930. And finally, to an explicit and informed commitment to Christianity by the summer of 1932. And it's a complex story, and part of what's interesting about McGrath's biography is he has a different take on it than a lot of biographers, because he thinks Lewis couldn't do math. This is the thing. The man was brilliant in terms of languages, but he was terrible in terms of math, and he regularly remembered dates wrong. And this is common for human beings. We remember ourselves often less well than those around us remember us, because we're all clouded by all kinds of biases. But Lewis's conversion begins with what was a tide of intellectual conversions going on in England, among literary people. Not all of the literary figures to convert to Christianity in this brief yet intense period of English revival adopted Catholicism. In 1927, T.S. Lewis, then best known for his poem The Wasteland, still widely acknowledged as one of the finest, most discussed poems in the 20th century, converted to Anglicanism. And there were many others who converted. And so then Lewis starts reading, and he starts reading all of these things. And again, this reminds me, I just watched I caught a little bit of the Joe Rogan Experience today live, and I think it's Joe Rogan Experience 1070. I had never watched Joe Rogan before I saw a couple of the couple of the Peterson interviews on Joe Rogan, and I thought, 1070, the interview I just watched today was a terrific interview, and good for Peterson. Boy, I'll tell you, after all the talking he's done, I'm amazed how much the guy can continue to talk. But what he talked about, now where was I going with this? Oh yeah, what he talked about with Peterson was how he wrote maps of meaning, and it took him 15 years to do this, and Peterson's own rather obsessive desire to false test his ideas in every line in his book. And a good friend of mine, Tim Blackman, who's the chaplain at Wheaton College, he was out in town a while ago, and he was asking me what I was reading, and I was saying, I'm into this, I'm devouring this Jordan Peterson guy, and he's really got me fascinated. And my friend Tim said, yeah, I tried to read his book. It was inscrutable. And this is Tim Blackman. Tim Blackman is about as smart as anybody I know and reads more than just about anybody I know. And he found Peterson's maps of meaning inscrutable. But Lewis makes the comment, if you want to stay an atheist, you'd better be careful about what you read, and you'd better be careful about how deeply you study, because the low resolution impression is that Christianity is just old tired ideas. Well, you might then have to ask the question why some of the most brilliant people on the planet continue on in their faith, and in fact testify to the fact that faith is what turns the light on for them. And this is exactly what Lewis shared. And so you have this renaissance, and you have this renaissance in literature, and people are becoming Christian. And then McGrath makes a point. Now McGrath is also from Northern Ireland. I don't know if I remember if I mentioned this before, and also an adult convert to Christianity, and also an intellectual, and in many ways also an apologist. And he makes the observation here that for Pascal, there was little point in trying to persuade anyone of the truth of religious belief. And I think that's right. The important thing, he argued, was to make people wish that it were true, having caught sight of the rich and satisfying vision of reality it offered. Once such a desire is implanted within the human heart, the human mind would eventually catch up with its deeper intuitions. And I think this is true. Tim Keller says very similar things about Christianity, and Tim Keller has been one of the more effective Christian evangelists in the United States in the last number of years, I think. And if you read Tim Keller's apologetic books, and I'm going to do a video about Tim Keller's talk at Princeton at some point. I've got way more videos that I want to do than I have time, especially when I start doing videos at the spur of the moment, but this is always my problem. Tim Keller's most quoted person in his The Reason for God and his second apologetic book is C.S. Lewis. And there's no accident to that. And if you read Francis Collins, The Language of God, Francis Collins helped break the code on the human genome and became Obama's very controversial pick for a high government position. I don't remember what it is right now offhand, but Francis Collins, who helped launch the website BioLogos that I've talked about in a number of my other videos. Reading Mere Christianity for Francis Collins, really did it for him. And there have been many, many stories that I know of people reading Mere Christianity. In fact, George Marsden, one of my history teachers at Calvin College, wrote a biography of the book Mere Christianity, which I read, which is well worth reading. But the key is here that, as Martin Luther said, reason is a whore, she'll work for anyone. And I love the way Luther talked. Once you want to be a Christian, those walls are going to come down, and the reverse is true, I think, too. Once you want to not be a Christian, you're halfway out the door. So this continues, and so one of the things that Lewis delved into was, for Lewis, medieval culture offered an imaginative vision of the unified cosmic and world order expressed in the poems of the Divine Comedy. And I think in some ways with Peterson too. Peterson is in some funny ways a medievalist when you listen to him. And now his background, unlike Lewis, we haven't Lewis is as he reminded Kathy Newman, I'm a clinical psychologist, and he is, and he's read a lot in a lot of things, but he hasn't gone into medieval literature much, and he's mentioned Milton a lot, and that comes up here too, because one of the early things that one of the important things that Lewis got into was in fact Milton. Here we see literary expression of the fundamental theological idea, namely that there is a certain way of seeing reality that brings it into the sharpest focus, illuminating the shadows and allowing its inner unity to be seen. This, for Lewis, is realizing imagination, a way of seeing or picturing reality that is faithful to the way things really are. And again, this makes me think of Peterson in Transliminal 2015. In terms of Peterson's quest to find out what is reality, and for Peterson language, that is what is being. And so you're taking the physical layer into reality. You're taking I'm going to use the word social hierarchy rather than dominance hierarchy, as Peterson seems to continue to work on that language, but then also the phenomenology, the subjective experience, and you have to get all of this. And a medievalist like Lewis was, understood that in medieval society, talk about a society that was fixed on order. And in many ways, as I've said before, it's the Protestant Reformation and all of the things that contribute to the Protestant Reformation. You can't blame this on Luther. Luther was in a sense the spark that lit the gasoline that was all over Europe, and the whole thing explodes then. But I think the medievals were all into this order, and so Lewis was that. And so Lewis portrays these not as moves that he made, but as moves that were against him. The narrative of Surprised by Joy is not of Lewis's discovery of God, but God's patient approach to Lewis. And again, I'm a Calvinist, and I think that finally, this is why I'm a non-anxious evangelist, and some of my friends find me too non-anxious, because I think finally God closes the deal with us. And this is all of the language that Lewis has, that Lewis uses the language of God bringing him kicking and screaming into the kingdom. And I'll tell you, when I read some of the comments, in the Jordan Peterson community, I hear that language for some of you. Some of you are like, this is not where I want to go. In fact, this is very much where I said I'd never go, and here I am toying with it. And, well, I suppose it's better than being possessed by some ideology. So on and on it goes. Looking for some of the stuff that I wanted to bring up. Yeah, the business about Lewis and the Great War, which I think Lewis suppressed. Lewis's 1916 treaty with reality was now in the process of collapsing around him, as he realized he could no longer maintain his old mental frontiers in the light of superior forces mustered against him. The reality with which no treaty can be made is upon me. The point that Lewis is making here is too easily overlooked. The image of a treaty with reality conveys a radical and comprehensive compartmentalization of thought that enables troubling and disturbing thoughts to be locked away so that they do not disturb everyday life. We saw Lewis using precisely this strategy to deal with the horrors of the Great War. Reality was subjugated to thought, which was like a net thrown over reality, taming it and robbing it of its ability to take by surprise and overcome. What Lewis discovered was that he could no longer domesticate reality. Like a tiger, it refused to be constrained by its artificial cage. It broke free and overwhelmed its former captor. And this is Lewis describing what it was like to find his atheism melting, to find it giving way. And he doesn't know why, and he doesn't want it to happen, yet part of him wants it to happen. And he can't simply ignore reality. And again, as I listen to Peterson, I hear things like this. I hear not only in Peterson, but in others listening to him. And it's like, I had this nice, neat materialism. I had this compartmentalized, and, I had it all together, and I'm listening to Jordan Peterson, and he's, doggone it, I don't want to go to church. I don't want to be around these crazy Christian people that, I don't want to put Thomas Kincaid pictures up in my room or have precious moments. Well, maybe that's for the Christians who know all that inside crap. But, so this is what's happening to Lewis, and it's happening as he's developing his relationship with Tolkien. And Tolkien, is this Roman Catholic, not necessarily. Well, that's not true. There are certain religious orders in Roman Catholicism that were enormously effective at evangelism. But Tolkien, explaining himself, why he's creating this modern fairy tale, why he's developing this, and Lewis can't help but go along with it. Now, as it worked out, Tolkien didn't have much respect for the Narnia Chronicles. Tolkien was, for Tolkien, this was a catastrophe, because Lewis was just, Lewis emptied the mythological toy box into Narnia. And if you watch like the Narnia movies as compared to Lord of the Rings, Tolkien had a real point, because Lewis is just pulling all the stops and bringing everything in. Don't worry about the backstory. He's just going to have fun with this. Whereas Tolkien was, this is his world, and it's all got to fit. And so, the elves need their own language, and Mordor needs its own language, and there needs to be a common tongue, and there needs to be a backstory, and there needs to be a mythology of the mythology. And of course, Lewis just writes Narnia, and Tolkien was horrified. And later in life, they had a falling out, which is really a tragic thing for both men. So Lewis is also, friends with Owen Barfield, and Barfield is taking things in another complete direction. And so this just goes on, and so this is why I, as a Calvinist, say, who could orchestrate stuff like this? And this was the sense that I had when I started watching Jordan Peterson. Who can believe this is happening? And today I posted around some. There's Rex Murphy on the National Post wrote a really amazing piece, and it's like, I sometimes play this game, King of Tokyo, and there are these little cards, and one of the cards is, you're only making him stronger. And Peterson today in the Joe Rogan Experience comments that he's, the first one to find a way to monetize the social justice warrior movement. I thought that was just hilarious, because every time they attack him, his tribe grows. And when I look at this and I watch this, and I just think, to me, okay, I'm a Christian. I'll lay my cards on the table, and I just say, it's God. I don't know any other way to say that. But now, be careful when you hear me say that, because remember, I'm a Calvinist, which means that, God is both the bringer of outstanding joy and blessings, but God is... This is Heidelberg Catechism, question and answer 10, or Lord's Day 10. This is the God of providence. He brings fat years and lean years. And all of this works into his plan for our lives. And so again, Jordan Peterson's comments about failure, I thought, yeah. And so this is this amazing drama called reality that we live in. And when I look at Jordan Peterson videos, I think God is at work. If I were to put it into C.S. Lewis language, I would say God is on the move. And God is a lion. God is a lion. And he's not a tame lion. And he does stuff in our lives that most of us would say, oh, Lord. But then we read the Garden of Gethsemane, and where his own son says, if you can find another way, please. And he sweats, drops that look like blood, or drops of blood, or however you want to see it. The agony in the garden. And so this is Lewis's agony as he becomes a Christian. And let's see if I can find some of what I'm looking for. So then he writes his friend Greaves again, who's, a lifelong confidant. I have just passed on from believing in God to believing in Christ and Christianity. I will try to explain this another time. My long night talk with Hugo Dyson and Tolkien had a good deal to do with it. And now Greaves at this point was, Greaves had never left the faith. he had maintained his Christian faith, and so this is just so here you've got this gay friend who's horribly disappointed that Lewis has no interest in him. And, Lewis, there's a lot of rumors that, Lewis was into some pretty rough stuff sexually and had a lot of sorting out sexually that he had to do throughout his life. But here's Arthur Greeves, and he's a Christian. And Lewis, is not a Christian. And so here you have this gay Christian praying for this, his pagan friend that he might become a Christian. And although Lewis's long talk involved both Dyson and Tolkien, it is Tolkien's approach that seems to have opened the door for Lewis to a wholly new way of looking at the Christian faith. To understand how Lewis passed from theism to Christianity, we need to reflect further on the ideas of JRR Tolkien. For it is he, more than anyone else, who helped Lewis along in the final stage of what the medieval writer Bonaventure describes as the journey of the mind of God. Tolkien helped Lewis to realize that the problem lay not in Lewis's rational failure to understand the theory. Now, again, this is something I see in many converts who are, who want to believe, but they've just got rational stumbling blocks, and so this is what Lewis is dealing with. So Tolkien helped Lewis to realize that the problem lay not in Lewis's rational failure to understand the theory, but in his imaginative failure to grasp the significance. And again, when I look at Peterson, this is what I see. Peterson is working on people's imaginations, and he's saying, now Peterson is offering rational arguments, but this is a war in the realm of the imagination that Peterson is bringing, and he's bringing all of this stuff from mythology. The issue is not primarily about truth, but about meaning. Are you Peterson fans hearing that? Again, why, when I started listening to Peterson, did C.S. Lewis come to mind? The issue is not truth, but meaning. Now, this isn't to let truth go, and Lewis certainly won't let truth go as an apologist. When engaging the Christian narrative, Lewis was limiting himself to his reason when he ought to be opening himself to the deepest intuitions of his imagination. Tolkien argued that Lewis ought to approach the New Testament with the same sense of imaginative openness and expectation that he brought to the reading of pagan myths in his professional studies. This is JRR Tolkien, an avowed, deeply committed Roman Catholic, in a sense doing to Lewis what Peterson is doing to the atheist world in his biblical lectures. He is saying, you need to read the Bible in a different way, boys and girls. And I lay part of the reason for this on the Enlightenment and the turn that Christianity took in the modernist fundamentalist move. And the problem is that both modernists and fundamentalists made this move. And I think this is part of the reason that Jonathan Pajot is so helpful in this conversation, because, the more I get into this, the more I realize that there are my grammatical historical tools for interpreting the Bible, and that's pretty much what all this is made of. But there are also the symbolic tools of interpreting the Bible. And what tended to happen in the post-Enlightenment Christian world is that those tools were set aside. And that's a serious mistake, given the fact that those tools were probably front and center in the minds of the authors of the text itself. And so in a sense, you don't quite get to authorial intention without the grammatical historical, but you're probably going to need the symbolic to get even beyond the grammatical historical. So I want to keep both of these tools in my tool shed as I go to the Bible. But the assault, and this is again in some of the reason I don't find William Lane Craig's approach to apologetics compelling. I think he's working in a sense on the reason, which there's good work to be done there, so I'm certainly not going to discourage him from that. But I think what showed in terms of Lewis's conversion, and what I'm seeing in terms of the new interest in Christianity in the wake of Jordan Peterson, is his work on the imagination. And I think Tolkien had that dead right, and why I'm finding so many Tolkien fans among Peterson fans. The story of Christ is simply a true myth, a myth working on us in the same way as others, but with this tremendous difference: it really happened. The reader must appreciate the word myth is not being used here in some loose sense as a fairy tale. And see, now maybe McGrath, you're going to want to alter that fairy tale thing if you listen to Jordan Peterson, because that's not a loose term either. And neither Tolkien nor Lewis would consider that a loose term. Read Tolkien's Fairy Stories essay, little book, tremendous essay. Leaf by Niggle. Read more of Tolkien. Tolkien is wonderful to read. So the reader must appreciate the word myth is not being used here in a loose sense as a fairy tale or a pejorative sense of a deliberate lie told in order to deceive. This is certainly how Lewis once understood myths, as lies breathed through silver. As used in the conversation between Lewis and Tolkien, the term myth must be understood in its technical literary sense if the significance of this interchange is to be appreciated. For Tolkien, a myth is a story that conveys fundamental things. In other words, that tries to tell us about the deep structures of things. Again, do you hear Peterson in this? Can I get an amen? This is Peterson. This is Tolkien. This is Lewis. This is not new. The best myths, he argues, are not deliberately constructed falsehood, but rather tales woven by people to capture the echoes of deeper truths. I hear Jung in this. Myths often fragment a truth, not its myths offer a fragment of that truth, not its totality. They are like splintered fragments of the true light. Yet when the full and true story is told, it is able to bring to fulfillment all that was right and wise in those fragmentary visions of things. For Tolkien, grasping Christianity's meaningfulness. Maps of meaning, boys and girls. Can I say this word enough? Meaningfulness took precedence over its truth. It provides that, now truth, I think we have to hear that in the modernistic sense. Because I would argue that what this is essentially saying is that, you can find truth in myths. And these Weinsteins, I heard that in Rogan, I'm probably saying their name wrong, and Brett, the one on with Rogan and Peterson, yes, he acknowledges that there are truths in this. It provides the total picture, unifying and transcending these fragmentary and imperfect insights. It's not difficult to see how Tolkien's way of thinking brought clarity and cohesion to the jumble of thoughts that so excited Lewis's mind at this time. For Tolkien, a myth awakens in its readers a longing for something that lies beyond their grasp. This is exactly what Peterson has been working through with all of this stuff. There's something beyond our grasp, and Peterson works through all of the ways in which this stuff gets encoded. But again, I read this and Peterson's all over the place. Myths possess an innate capacity to expand the consciousness of their readers, allowing them to transcend themselves. At their best, myths offer what Lewis later terms a real, though unfocused gleam of divine truth falling on human imagination. Christianity, rather than being one myth among many others, is thus the fulfillment of all previous mythological religions. Christianity tells a true story about humanity, which makes sense of all the stories that humanity tells about itself. Tolkien's way of thinking clearly spoke deeply to Lewis. It answers a question that had troubled Lewis since his teenage years. How could Christianity alone be true and everything else be false? Lewis now realized that he did not have to declare the great myths of the pagan age were totally false. They were echoes or anticipations of the full truth, which was made known only in and through the Christian faith. Christianity brings to fulfillment and completion imperfect and partial insights about reality scattered abroad in human culture. Tolkien gave Lewis a lens, a way of seeing things, which allowed him to see Christianity as bringing to fulfillment such echoes and shadows of the truth that arose from human questioning and yearning. If Tolkien was right, similarities between Christianity and pagan religions ought to be there. There would be a problem if such similarities did not exist. Perhaps more important, Tolkien allowed Lewis to reconnect the worlds of reason and imagination. And when we start looking at the book Miracles by C.S. Lewis, that's exactly the nexus that we need to get into. Where do reason and imagination meet? And it's going to be a similar nexus to where do reason and nature meet? No longer was the realm of longing, joy, sensuch to be sidelined and suppressed as the new look demanded, and as Lewis feared belief in God might imply, it could be woven naturally and convincingly into the greater narrative of reality that Tolkien had presented. As Tolkien put it, God has willed that the hearts of men should seek beyond the world and should find no rest therein. Read the beginning of Mere Christianity. That's C.S. Lewis's argument from Desire. Christianity, Lewis realized, allowed him to affirm the importance of longing and yearning within a reasonable account of reality. God was the true source from which those arrows of joy had been shot ever since childhood. Reason and imagination alike were thus affirmed and reconciled by the Christian vision of reality. Tolkien thus helped Lewis to realize that a rational faith was not necessarily imaginatively and emotionally barren. When rightly understood, the Christian faith could integrate reason, longing, and imagination. This is why when I listen to Peterson, I hear Lewis. I began listening to Peterson, and I listened and listened, and I just had Lewis ringing in my ears because I've read almost all of Lewis's Christian stuff, I think, and a bunch of it a number of times, and Lewis just. Okay, I'll lay my cards on the table. I'll try not to be a lying pastor. Hey, pastors have doubts. You think the cross pressures of what Charles Taylor talks about, you think they don't hit me? You think there aren't times when I study the Bible, or when I read things, or when I do things that I think, what if I'm wrong? What if I have devoted my whole 54 years of my life to what Sam Harris and some of the other atheists simply dismiss as not only a bad idea, but a horrible idea? Boy, I'm screwed in some significant ways if that is true. I don't feel that way, but I have my doubts. And so when I do have my doubts, I read Lewis. And because Lewis speaks to my imagination, and he speaks to my reason, and he helps me put the world together. And I've mentioned before that I've read Miracles. I read the book Miracles once or twice a year, because that book, I find, Mere Christianity is a wonderful book. I reread a lot of other Lewis stuff very regularly. I keep Lewis books in my Audible account on my phone, and I pull them up, and if I feel the doubts starting to well up within me, I put on Lewis. But, Lewis, I read Miracles almost continually, because what Lewis helps me see is exactly what McGrath shows us that Tolkien helped Lewis see. This is part of the reason, if you listen to Tim Keller, so I'm a fanboy. I get obsessed with things, and it's probably better that I get obsessed with people like, not really people. I'm not a stalker. I don't stalk these men. But, I read, I listened to just about everything Tim Keller had spoken in audio format. That's before he had much in written form. And, I've devoured Tim Keller for years because I found him so helpful. And he was especially helpful to me at a low point in my life. I had gotten to a point that, it was probably feeling burnout. There were some serious things going on in my world, and I was struggling with a lot of things. And what I started to do was listen to 1 or 2 Tim Keller sermons a day, and it just helped give me a floor to stand on. And I did that for a number of years, and then got to a point, and I was just kind of done with it, which is fine, nothing against him, but I was just kind of done with it. And then 8 months ago, I start listening to Jordan Peterson stuff. And again, it starts feeding me in some interesting ways. And, whereas as a Christian Reformed pastor, listening to Tim Keller's pretty safe. Well, it isn't totally safe because I won't get into all the intramural CRC spats, but listening to Tim Keller's pretty safe. But then I start listening to Jordan Peterson, and that's not nearly as safe as listening to Tim Keller because, well, Jordan Peterson, and he's got, he's a number in some shallow reporters have done hit jobs on Peterson. And so I have a good number of friends that are in Canada. And so when I talk about Peterson, and some still do, they'll, Paul White, don't just stay away from him. Don't do this. Well, hey, I'm going to do it anyway. And if I'm going to do it, I need to get to the bottom of it. And so, again, I'd listen to Peterson, and then I'd listen to Miracles, and I'd go back and forth. And I'd listen to Sam Harris, and I'd read Miracles. And when I hear people talking about randomness, I'd think, let's talk about nature. And let's talk about what you say nature is. That's, again, presuppositional apologetics. Now I'm rambling, now I'm going on, and I didn't want to do a 2-hour video, so I'm going to stop now. But this is just an introduction to Lewis. Some of you might not know C.S. Lewis. And again, if some of you are asking for book recommendations, I'd say start with C.S. Lewis. And if you've never read a C.S. Lewis book, start with Mere Christianity. Start with Mere Christianity. It's one of his most popular books. You can find it translated into many different languages. After maybe, my practice often is if I start doing some reading with someone, I'll want to read a biography fairly early on because I'll want to kind of understand where or when in a person's life they wrote a book because, my undergraduate degree is in history. And so I've always been a lover of history. So if you want a book recommendation or you want an author recommendation, read C.S. Lewis, read Mere Christianity, and then maybe pick up one of these 2 biographies and maybe start with McGrath. It's a little shorter. It's a little newer than Alan Jacobs, but Alan Jacobs' biography, again, this was quite a few years ago that I read his biography, but I loved it. And Alan Jacobs is just such a wonderful writer, and you can find him out there on the internet and on Twitter. Deeply, deeply Christian thinker. So, that's what I'm going to do today, and I hope it's helpful.